On a cliff by the sea, a wedding was about to begin. The groom was waiting, but the bride vanished into the mist. For 22 years, everyone believed she ran away, until a freak tide revealed a single, impossible clue buried beneath the waves. The air in Monterey, that May morning in 2003, carried with it the kind of crystalline clarity that poets spend their lives trying to capture. It was an air that tasted of salt, damp earth, and the sweet, resinous promise of the cypress trees that clung with ancient tenacity to the cliffs. For Eleonora Ellie Vance, this was not just air, it was inspiration, the very breath of the new life she was about to begin. At 24, she was a whirlwind of creative force, a young woman who seemed to experience the world with a heightened sensitivity that both delighted and overwhelmed her. Her poetry wasn't just a hobby, it was the essential byproduct of her existence, the way she processed the riot of color and emotion that was constantly flooding her senses. Her notebooks were filled with lines about the bruised purple of the evening sea and the silver gossip of the waves. Today, however, her joy was a quiet, internal hum, a secret melody played only for herself. Tucked securely inside the pocket of her simple, elegant white sundress was a heavy, velvet-wrapped object. It was a silver-plated edition of Neruda's Love Sonnets, a book she had spent 2 months searching for. On its cover, she'd had a local artisan emboss her own initials, E.V., a subtle mark of possession before the book became a gift for Julian. A small secret smile touched her lips. Julian Croft was the calm harbor to her restless sea. Where she was all feeling and impulse, he was logic and ambition, a man so handsome and charming that he seemed less born and more engineered for success. He grounded her, she often told her slightly worried parents, while she taught him how to fly. Her parents, David and Marion Vance, both quiet academics who revered the written word, adored Julian's charisma, but harbored a gentle skepticism about the sheer velocity of the romance. "He's a force of nature, dear," Marion had told her just last week over tea. "Just be sure it's your nature he's captivated by, not just the idea of you." Ellie had brushed off the concern with a laugh, but the words had left a small, lingering echo. She loved Julian with a fierce, all-consuming passion, yet she knew there were parts of him, particularly his world of finance and deals, that remained opaque to her, a language she didn't speak. That was the primary reason for their elopement. No grand wedding with its attendant pressures and probing questions from relatives, just the two of them, their vows and the vast, impartial witness of the Pacific. Their chosen sanctuary was a small, slightly weathered wooden gazebo perched on a cliffside bluff, a place of profound significance for them. It was where Julian had first told her he loved her, his voice a smooth counterpoint to the raw roar of the ocean below. It was where she had read him a poem she'd written just for him, her own words feeling clumsy and inadequate in the face of her feelings. As she walked the winding coastal path, the famous Monterey fog was beginning to retreat, burning off under the strengthening sun to reveal a sky of impossible blue. She felt the familiar flutter of anxiety, a sensation she had learned to live with, but today it was tinged with excitement, not dread. This was the ultimate romantic act, a story she would one day turn into a poem. She imagined Julian's face when she handed him the book, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he smiled his perfect, easy smile. 100 yards away, that same perfect smile was fixed on Julian Croft's face, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He stood beside Arthur Penhaligon, a portly, sunburnt man with a kind face who had retired from the judicial bench and now officiated private ceremonies for a handsome fee. Julian radiated an aura of calm, happy anticipation, but internally a frantic, high-wire act was unfolding. In his pocket, his phone was a dead weight. The last text he'd read before turning it off sat burned into his memory. "Today, Croft, no excuses, no delays." The message was from Slavic, a man who did not make idle threats. Everything, his reputation, his future, his very physical safety, was riding on the next 30 minutes. "She'll be here," Julian said, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. He was projecting the reality he needed to exist. He looked impeccable in a beige linen suit that must have cost a fortune, his blonde hair catching the sunlight. He was playing the part of the lucky groom. But 5 minutes stretched into a tense, silent 10. Arthur, the officiant, shifted his weight, his own cheerful demeanor starting to fray. Perhaps the path was a bit more winding than she remembered? He offered. "No, this is our spot," Julian said, his smile tightening fractionally. "She knows it like the back of her hand." He began to feel a prickle of genuine irritation mixed with his anxiety. For all her talk of freedom, Ellie was meticulously punctual when it came to him. It was one of the things he secretly liked about her reliability, the way her chaotic energy always, in the end, orbited him. Another 10 minutes bled away. The sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows. The magic of the morning was curdling. Julian's performance had to begin its transition. He walked a few paces down the path, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Ellie!" he called, his voice carrying over the sound of the gulls. "Darling!" There was no reply. He returned to the gazebo, his face now a mask of carefully modulated concern. "This isn't right," he said, running a hand through his perfect hair, mussing it just enough to look distressed. "Something's wrong." He started to walk again, this time breaking into a light jog, calling her name with increasing urgency. He disappeared around a bend for a few moments before returning, breathless now, his face flushed. The seed of panic was being planted for his audience of one. "I'm going to check the main road," he announced, his voice tight. "Maybe her car broke down." The next hour was a master class in controlled hysteria. He made a show of calling her phone, his own hand shaking with what Arthur took for fear, but was, in reality, a tremor of pure adrenaline. Finally, with the sun directly overhead, he looked at Arthur, his blue eyes wide with what appeared to be dawning horror. "We have to call the police," he said, his voice cracking with practiced perfection. The arrival of the Monterey Police Department shattered the sacred quiet of the cliffs. The scene transformed into a tableau of grim procedure. Uniformed officers fanned out their methodical movements, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed beauty of the coastline. Detective Miles Corbin, then a sharp-eyed detective in his 30s, took the lead. He found Julian sitting on a rock, his head in his hands, the very picture of a man broken by circumstance. Under the flat, dispassionate lighting of an interrogation room back at the station, Julian wove the narrative that would define Ellie's disappearance for the next 2 decades. He painted a portrait of Ellie as a beautiful, brilliant, but ultimately fragile creature. "She was a bird, you know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The most beautiful bird, but you can't cage something like that. I thought our love was a big enough sky for her to fly in. But maybe the idea of any sky with borders, even a loving one, was too much." He then delivered the crucial invented detail. He described walking towards the highway in his frantic search and seeing a yellow taxicab pulling away, heading north. "I didn't see her get in," he admitted, a brilliant touch of verisimilitude. "I just saw the cab. It was just a feeling. But now I'm sure of it. She fled. She got cold feet and she ran." When David and Marion Vance arrived, their faces etched with a numb, uncomprehending terror, Julian enveloped them in his story, his grief acting as both a comfort and a cage. Marion, her resolve firm even in her shock, immediately rejected the theory. Eleonora would not run, she stated, her voice trembling but firm. She was a sensitive soul, but she was not a coward. "And she loved you, Julian. She would have called us. She would have called you." But Julian's story, told from the epicenter of the tragedy, held more weight than a mother's intuition. He was the man on the ground, the heartbroken fiancé. The police had no body, no evidence of foul play, nothing to contradict his plausible, romantic, and tragic tale. The narrative began to set like concrete in the public consciousness. Eleonora Vance, the gifted local poet, had become a victim of her own artistic temperament, a runaway bride who chose the open road over a settled life. The file was eventually moved to the cold case cabinet, a story with an ending written by a liar. And Julian Croft, the man who had everything to lose, was recast by the community as the man who had lost everything. A tragic figure worthy of their deepest sympathy. He accepted their condolences, their support, and their admiration. all while knowing the truth was lying in the cold, silent darkness just a quarter-mile to the south. 22 years is an eternity. It is long enough for a frantic, open wound of a mystery to scar over, becoming a piece of local folklore, a ghost story told to tourists. It is long enough for a liar to repeat his story so many times that it begins to feel like his own truth, its falsehoods worn smooth and comfortable like a favorite stone in a pocket. The Monterey of 2025 was, in many ways, a different world from that of 2003. Tech money from Silicon Valley had crept down the coast, polishing the old town with a new, expensive sheen. And at the heart of the community's social and charitable life was the JV&V. End of Chapter 2. Foundation, a philanthropic powerhouse run by the still handsome, now distinguished Julian Croft. His tragic story was his foundation myth, lending him an aura of gravitas and depth that money alone could not buy. The memory of Eleanora Vance had been transmuted by Julian's careful design into a legacy of scholarships, arts funding, and coastal preservation, a beautiful monument built upon a lie. The past, however, is never truly past. It is merely submerged, waiting for the right pressure or the right tremor to bring it back to the surface. In March of 2025, that tremor came. It was not a violent, destructive earthquake that brought buildings down. It was a deep, groaning shift in the tectonic plates far beneath the Pacific floor, a geological sigh that lasted less than a minute. On land, it was little more than a novelty, a conversation starter. But its effect on the ocean was dramatic and profound. It triggered a Syzygian alignment of the sun and moon that coincided with a perigee tide, creating an event oceanographers called a king tide. The sea seemed to hold its breath and pull back, retreating from the shore to an extent no living person had ever witnessed. It unveiled a secret coastline, a strip of rock and sand and hidden caves that had been sealed by the ocean for more than a century. For Dr. Eris Thorne, a 68-year-old marine biologist with hands as gnarled as cypress roots and an encyclopedic knowledge of the bay, this was not just a scientific opportunity, it was a revelation. He had spent 45 years studying this coastline, believing he knew its every mood and secret. The king tide proved him wrong. With him was Lena Petrova, his doctoral student, a brilliant and intensely focused young woman from whom Eris was learning as much as he was teaching. Where Eris operated on a lifetime of observation and intuition, Lena moved through the world with data, her tablet and array of sensors, her primary sensory organs. They were among a handful of scientists granted access to the newly exposed intertidal zone at the base of the cliffs south of the old gazebo point. The landscape was alien, breathtakingly strange. The air itself felt ancient, thick with the smell of brine and primordial decay, a scent that had been trapped under water for generations. They moved through a forest of bizarre, pale sea anemones and ghostly white crabs that had never known sunlight, scurrying for cover in the sudden, shocking brightness. "The biodiversity here is astounding," Lena murmured, her voice filled with a reverence usually reserved for libraries or cathedrals. She was meticulously documenting everything, her camera's flash, a tiny artificial strobe in the vast geological gloom of the sea caves that pockmarked the cliff face. Eris, meanwhile, was moving with a kind of boyish wonder, running his hand over rock formations that no human had touched in living memory. He felt like a trespasser on a forgotten planet. "Imagine the pressure these organisms endure," he said, his voice echoing in a cavernous opening. "The sheer, crushing weight of the ocean day in and day out. To survive here, you have to be resilient." They worked their way into the largest of the caves, a space so deep its end was lost in absolute darkness. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic dripping of water from stone stalactites, a sound like a slow, patient clock counting down the minutes until the sea would return to reclaim its lost territory. Lena, ever the pragmatist, was focused on her task, cataloging a species of translucent shrimp near the cave floor. Her headlamp, a bright, focused beam, cut a surgical path through the darkness. As she panted across the cave wall, documenting the strata of rock, the light snagged on something. It wasn't a flicker of bioluminescence or the wet sheen of stone. It was a hard, dull glint of reflected light, angular and unnatural. It was wrong. Everything else in the cave was the product of slow, organic, chaotic processes. This was something made. "Eris," she said, her voice dropping the scientific formality, "come look at this." He made his way over, his boots crunching on shells and loose rock. He followed her beam to a spot low on the wall where two basalt columns had grown together over time, forming a tight, narrow crevice. Wedged deep inside that crevice was the object. At first glance it was just a lump, so thoroughly encrusted with calcified barnacles and marine growth that it was almost perfectly camouflaged. It looked like a natural concretion. "Odd," Eris mused. "Must be a piece of modern refuse, maybe a plastic case washed in and trapped decades ago." But its shape was too uniform. He pulled a small geological hammer and a chisel from his worn leather belt. "Let's see what secrets you're keeping," he murmured to the rock. For the next 20 minutes he worked with the patient, precise movements of a surgeon. The crack of the hammer was a sharp, intrusive sound in the ancient silence. Lena held her light steady, her own curiosity piqued. Finally, with a sharp crack, a large piece of the calcified shell broke away. Eris reached into the crevice and pulled. The object resisted, held fast by a century of the ocean's grip. He braced himself and pulled harder, and with a low, sucking sound it came free. It was surprisingly heavy, dense. They carried it back towards the mouth of the cave, where the pale afternoon light could illuminate it. They laid it on a flat rock and began to carefully scrape and chip away the remaining layers. As the marine debris fell away, a shape began to emerge. It was a small, rectangular box, dark and heavily pitted. "Too small for a tackle box," Lena observed. "Too thick for a camera case from that era." Eris used the edge of his chisel to pry at a seam. As he did, a large flake of corrosion came off, revealing a dark, silver-plated surface beneath. He stopped, his movements becoming even more delicate. It wasn't a box, it was a book, with metal-plated covers. Its pages were fused into a solid, waterlogged block, a pulpy mess that was beyond saving. But the covers had endured. Lena took a cloth from her pack, dampened it with fresh water from her canteen, and began to gently wipe away the last of the grime from the front cover. The surface was mottled and scarred, a testament to its long war with the sea. But as the last layer of silt was wiped away, she saw them. Etched into the silver, their lines still sharp and clear despite the decay, were two letters, elegant, stylized initials. "E.V." Lena traced them with her finger. "E.V.," she said aloud, a simple observation. For Eris Thorne, those two letters landed with the force of a physical blow. He went absolutely still, the sounds of the dripping water and the distant surf fading into a dull roar in his ears. He was no longer a scientist in a cave. He was a young man again, reading the front page of the Monterey Herald in 2003. The headlines, the beautiful, smiling photograph of the missing poet. The tragic story of the runaway bride that had haunted the coastline for years. Eleonora Vance. He looked from the impossible object in his hands to the vast, indifferent ocean, and a cold dread washed over him. This wasn't just refuse. This wasn't an artifact. This was a piece of a life, a story that had been told wrong. This book was not lost. It was hidden. The sea hadn't claimed it. It had kept it. And now, for reasons of its own, it had given it back. The cold case unit of the Monterey Police Department was housed in the station's basement, a warren of cramped offices where the air carried the faint, papery scent of decomposing files and stale coffee. It was a place for ghosts. The walls were lined with gray metal filing cabinets, each drawer a tombstone for an unsolved crime, a life interrupted. This was the kingdom of Detective Miles Corbin. In a year he would retire, leaving behind a 40-year career filled with triumphs and, more hauntingly, a few stubborn, lingering failures. The Eleonora Vance case was his white whale. He remembered the file not just for its frustrating lack of evidence, but for the profound, quiet sorrow of Ellie's parents, a sorrow he felt he had personally failed to alleviate. His partner, Detective Isabella "Izzy" Reyes, was his antithesis and his professional salvation. Where Corbin saw ghosts and felt the weight of history, Reyes saw data sets and flawed narratives. She believed that time didn't just bury clues, it also created them. Digital footprints, financial records. Shifting Allegiance Sesh was an archaeologist of the recent past, and her tools were subpoenas and sophisticated search algorithms. She approached every cold case with the fervent, dispassionate belief that there was no such thing as a perfect lie, only an unexamined one. When Dr. Eris Thorne and Lena Petrova delivered the silver-plated book, carefully sealed in an evidence box, the atmosphere in the basement crackled with a sudden electric energy. Corbin held the object, his gloved hands feeling the impossible weight of its 22 years in the dark. It was a tangible link to a ghost. Reyes, however, was already at her workstation, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Before we do anything else, let's kill the official story," she said, her eyes fixed on her dual monitors. She pulled up maritime charts, historical weather patterns from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for the third week of May, 2003, and the original case files, including Julian Croft's sworn testimony. Within an hour, she had built a comprehensive model, cross-referencing Julian's timeline with the oceanic conditions of that specific day. She called Corbin over. On one screen was a topographical map of the coastline. On the other, a complex swirl of data points and current vectors. "It's not just unlikely, Miles," she said, her voice sharp with certainty. "It's impossible." Factoring in the wind speed from the west-northwest at the time, the tidal state, and the dominant northbound Monterey Canyon current, for that book to end up in that specific cave from anywhere north of it, it would have had to defy the laws of physics. It didn't float there. It didn't wash up there. It was placed there. Corbin looked at the screen, then at the book. "He lied," he said, the words feeling both shocking and completely inevitable. The entire foundation of the case was a lie. Their first move had to be a soft one. They needed to interview the subject, but confronting him now would be premature. They needed to see the man Julian Croft had become. The JV Foundation occupied the top 2 floors of the most prestigious new glass and steel building in Monterey. The elevator ride was silent and swift, opening into a reception area that felt more like a modern art gallery than an office. A stylish assistant offered them sparkling water while they waited, the hushed, serene atmosphere a world away from their basement office. Julian Croft's name was etched on a glass wall, a symbol of transparent, benevolent power. He greeted them not in his office, but in a comfortable lounge area with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a God's eye view of the bay. He was 50 years old now, but time had been exceptionally kind. His hair was a distinguished silver at the temples, his face carried the faint lines of a life well lived, and his physique was that of a man who had a personal trainer. He was the very picture of success and serene authority. He shook their hands, his grip firm, his blue eyes radiating a practiced warmth. Corbin began, explaining the discovery with a gentle, almost apologetic tone. He watched Julian closely as he detailed the finding of the book. The performance was flawless. Julian's face registered a flicker of shock, followed by a wave of deep, complicated sorrow. He sank into a plush leather armchair, steepling his fingers before his lips, as if in prayer. He looked out at the bay that had been the backdrop to his public grief for 2 decades. "My God," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "after all this time, to think it's been out there, that little book." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. She was so proud of that gift. She called it "Our Story's Beginning." He looked back at the detectives, his eyes glistening. "Well, I suppose this brings a final, painful kind of closure. She must have thrown it into the sea, you know. In that moment of panic. A final, symbolic act of letting go. It makes a sad kind of sense, doesn't it? He had done it brilliantly. He hadn't just denied, he had absorbed their new evidence into his existing narrative, reinforcing it, making it even more tragic and poetic. He was not a suspect. He was the chief mourner, graciously helping them close this final chapter. "It's possible," Reyes said, her voice studiously neutral. We'll need you to come in to sign a formal statement to that effect, Mr. Croft, just to tie up the loose ends on the file." "Of course, Detective. Anything you need," he said, standing to signal the end of the interview. "Thank you for bringing this to me personally. It means a great deal." As they rode the elevator down, the silence was heavy. "He's good," Corbin finally said, breaking the quiet. "He's had 22 years to perfect that story. It's almost believable." "Almost," Reyes countered, her jaw set. "He overplayed the poetry of it. He was trying to sell us. Now we find out why." The real investigation began the next day. It was a slow, painstaking excavation. Reyes worked backwards, starting with Julian's vast legitimate business empire and peeling it away layer by layer, looking for the rot beneath. The first 2 weeks yielded nothing. His current finances were impeccable, his charitable works lauded and transparent. "We're looking in the wrong place," she declared one late night, surrounded by takeout containers and stacks of financial reports. "He's clean now. We need to find the dirt from 2003. This meant going deeper into digital archives that were clunky and poorly organized, into microfiche records from defunct banks. It was Reyes who found the first crack. An old email, recovered from a defunct server from a company Julian had dissolved in 2004, mentioned a wire transfer to a shell corporation called Slavic Holdings, LLC. The name was a red flag. It sounded less like a business and more like a character from a spy novel. From there, the dam began to break. Slavic Holdings led them to a notorious loan shark out of San Jose, a man named Dmitry Slavic Volkov, who had a long and brutal history of lending money to desperate, wealthy men at crippling interest rates. It took another week of navigating legal hurdles to subpoena the records from that shell corporation. But when they finally came through, the story they told was damning. In late 2002, Julian Croft had taken out a $500,000 loan using his then-fledgling company as collateral. A series of disastrous high-risk investments had failed, and he was on the hook for the full amount, plus an exorbitant amount of interest. The final payment was due on May 31, 2003. The record showed frantic, escalating threats from Volkov's associates throughout April and May. Julian was a man backed into a corner, facing financial ruin and, very likely, severe physical harm. "There's the motive," Corbin said, staring at the printouts spread across their evidence board. He wasn't a successful entrepreneur. He was a gambler who lost big and was about to pay the price. The next piece of the puzzle required a more human touch. While Reyes continued her digital dig, Corbin decided to follow up on a loose thread from the original file, the officiant Arthur Penhaligon. He found him living in a quiet, sun-drenched retirement community in Mesa, Arizona. Corbin flew out to meet him. Arthur was 90 now, his memory a flickering candle in the wind of old age. But Corbin was patient. He sat with the old man on a shaded patio, letting him talk, gently guiding him back to that May morning in 2003. "I remember the groom," Arthur said slowly, his eyes unfocused. "A handsome fellow, polished, but antsy. Kept checking his phone." "His phone?" Corbin leaned in, keeping his voice calm. "Do you remember anything he said? It could be important." Arthur closed his eyes, concentrating. "It was the tone I remember most. He was trying to be quiet, but he was vicious, angry." The old man's eyes opened, a flicker of clarity returning. "Yes, I remember what he said. He thought I was out of earshot." He hissed into the phone. He said, "The deal is happening today, or it's not happening at all. You just make sure it goes through." I thought it was some last-minute business deal he was closing. Seemed odd for a man about to be married. Corbin felt a surge of adrenaline. It was the corroboration he needed. The deal wasn't a stock trade. The deal was the wedding. He was on the phone with his creditor, assuring him that the money would be secured that very day. The final piece was the mechanism. How did the marriage solve his problems? A call to the San Francisco law firm that had managed the Vance family's affairs provided the stark, simple answer. A junior partner from that era, now a senior name on the letterhead, remembered the family well. He confirmed the terms of Eleonora Vance's trust fund. It was a substantial 7-figure sum, and its terms were ironclad. It was to be released to her upon her 25th birthday or upon her legal marriage, whichever came first. In May of 2003, Ellie was 24. Her wedding day was scheduled just 1 week before Julian's catastrophic loan was due. Back in the basement office, Corbin and Reyes stood before their evidence board. It was a complete narrative of a lie. On one side was Julian's story, a runaway bride, a tragic romance, a life of noble grief. On the other side was the truth, written in red marker. The book, Geographic Impossibility, proves he lied about her location. The debts, catastrophic financial pressure, a clear and powerful motive. The trust, the mechanism. Marriage meant immediate access to the money. The phone call. The state of mind. Not a loving fiancé, but a desperate, angry man closing a deal. They didn't have a body. They didn't have a weapon. But they had something more powerful. They had the complete anatomy of the lie Julian Croft had built his life on. "It's time," Corbin said, his voice grim. "Let's bring him in and knock it all down." The interrogation room was a deliberate void. 4 gray walls, a scuffed linoleum floor, a single heavy steel table bolted to the center. The air hummed with the low, monotonous drone of the building's ventilation system, a sound designed to be both unnoticeable and unsettling. On one wall, a large, dark pane of glass reflected the room back on itself. It wasn't a mirror. It was an audience, a dead, unblinking eye that absorbed everything and gave nothing back. This was a place where narratives came to die, where carefully constructed lives were disassembled piece by painful piece. Julian Croft entered the room with an air of weary magnanimity. He was not a suspect being interrogated. He was a prominent citizen assisting the police with a final, sad formality. He was flanked by his lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, whose $3,000 suit and reptilian smile were their own form of armor. Julian nodded curtly at Corbin and Reyes, who were already seated, and took a chair. He didn't shrug off his jacket. He carefully removed it, folded it once, and laid it on the empty chair beside him. A small act of domesticity meant to claim the sterile space as his own. "Detectives," Marcus Thorne began, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "My client is here voluntarily to assist in closing this painful chapter. We trust this will be brief. He has a flight to a conference in Zurich this evening." "We appreciate his time," Corbin said, his voice flat. He offered nothing more, letting the silence stretch for a moment. He could see Julian's composure, the relaxed set of his shoulders, the easy confidence. It was the composure of a man who believed he was untouchable. Corbin began gently, his approach that of a historian, not an accuser. "Mr. Croft, for the official record, we need to go over the events of May 23rd, 2003, one last time. I know it's difficult, but the new evidence requires a fresh statement." Julian inclined his head, a gesture of solemn understanding. "I understand. Ask whatever you need." And so he recited it. For the next 10 minutes, Julian Croft narrated the lie that had become his life's great work. He spoke of Ellie's beauty that morning, the way the light caught in her dark hair. He described her nervous energy, her poetic soul grappling with the prosaic reality of marriage. He recounted his own growing anxiety as the minutes ticked by. Then came the heart of the fabrication, polished to a high sheen by 22 years of repetition. "I walked up toward the highway," he said, his voice lowering with remembered pain. "I just had this feeling, a desperate hope that maybe her car had broken down, that she was waiting for me. That's when I saw it. The sun was bright. I remember squinting against the glare off the pavement. It was a yellow cab, one of the old Ford Crown Victoria models. It was heading north on Highway 1. It was too far away to see who was inside, but I knew she was in it, running away from me, from us." He paused, letting the tragic image hang in the air. "It was the last time I ever saw anything of her." His performance was masterful. It was filled with sensory details and emotional vulnerability. It was the story of a heartbroken man, and he had told it so long he almost seemed to believe it himself. His lawyer sat back, a faint look of satisfaction on his face. This was unshakable. Reyes leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Croft. That was very clear." She slid her hand onto the table, and with a soft rustle pushed a large sealed evidence bag into the center. Inside, resting on a bed of white foam, was the tarnished, silver-plated book. A flicker. It was almost imperceptible, but Corbin saw it. A brief, involuntary tightening around Julian's eyes, a slight stiffening in his shoulders before he forced them to relax. His lawyer, Marcus, was already speaking. "Detectives, we have already discussed this object. As my client has stated, it is a tragic artifact, but its discovery doesn't change the facts. Eleonora was clearly in a state of turmoil. It is entirely plausible, even likely, that she threw the book into the ocean as a symbolic gesture before she left." Julian nodded in agreement, his face now a mask of sorrowful resignation. "Marcus is right. It's what she would have done. She was always dramatic, poetic. It was her way of saying goodbye. He was trying to absorb the book into his narrative, to make it a part of his lie." "Let's talk about that," Reyes said, her voice dangerously quiet. She stood and placed a large laminated coastal map on the table, its sheer size covering the book and dominating the space. "Let's talk about poetry." With a red dry erase marker, she drew a neat circle around the cliffside gazebo. "This is where you were to be married." She drew another circle on the highway, far to the north. "And this is where you claim you saw the taxi carrying Ellie away." Her hand then moved slowly, deliberately, down the map, past the gazebo, to a jagged section of the coastline far to the south. She drew a third, final circle. "And this is the sea cave where the book was found, 280 yards south of the gazebo." She uncapped the marker and looked directly at Julian. "We gave all this information to a team of oceanographers at Scripps. We gave them the date, the time, the exact tidal conditions, the wind direction, the bathymetry of the bay. They ran 17 different simulation models." She paused, letting the clinical language sink in. "In all 17 simulations, an object dropped from the highway, or even from the gazebo itself, would have been carried north by the Monterey Canyon current, unequivocally. The probability of it traveling against the current, around this headland, and depositing itself deep inside that specific southern cave is 0. She capped the marker with a sharp click that echoed in the silent room. "It's not poetic, Mr. Croft, it's physics. The book could not have gotten there if your story is true." Marcus Thorne scoffed, trying to regain control. "Oh, come now, detective. Models? Simulations? You can't convict a man on a computer program. There are freak waves, rogue currents." "No," Corbin cut in, his voice a low growl. "There aren't. Not like that. We're past the point of convenient theories, Marcus." He turned his full attention to Julian, his eyes holding an intensity that made the high-priced lawyer fall silent. "We know about the debts, Julian. We know about Slavic. We know he gave you a deadline of May 31st. We know that your marriage to Ellie, and the immediate access to her trust fund it would have provided, was the only thing standing between you and financial annihilation." Julian's face, which had been pale, now seemed to turn to wax. The carefully maintained mask of the philanthropist, the grieving lover, was cracking under the immense pressure of the facts. The air in the room was getting thin, heavy. "You lied about your finances," Reyes continued, her voice a relentless, prosecuting weapon. "You lied about your state of mind. We have the officiant's statement about your angry phone call that morning. You weren't a nervous groom. You were a desperate man closing a deal." Julian stared at the map, at the 3 red circles that formed an iron triangle from which there was no escape. His story, his sanctuary for 22 years, had been methodically, scientifically, and completely demolished. He looked from Reyes's cold, logical certainty to Corbin's weary, knowing eyes. He saw no doubt, no room for negotiation. He saw only the end. Corbin leaned forward, his voice dropping, becoming almost intimate. "The book doesn't lie, Julian. The ocean doesn't lie. The numbers don't lie. For 22 years, Ellie's parents have believed their daughter abandoned them. They have lived with the pain of that belief, a pain you personally inflicted on them with your story." He paused, letting the weight of that statement fill the suffocating silence. "We are done with your story. It's over. He pointed a single steady finger at the third red circle on the map. "You told us for 22 years she went north. So you tell us, Julian. Tell us how her gift to you ended up south." It was the final question, the one that had no answer within his fabricated world. Julian Croft looked at the map, at the damning geography of his crime. His mouth opened and closed silently. His composure, the product of 2 decades of disciplined deception, did not just crack, it shattered into a million pieces. His shoulders, which had been held with such arrogant confidence, slumped forward as if the weight of every lie he had ever told had descended upon him at once. His face, once handsome and controlled, collapsed into a mask of pure, abject despair. The interrogators said nothing, letting the silence press down on him. A minute passed, then another. Finally, a sound escaped his lips. It was a ragged, wretched sound, the noise of a soul tearing apart. He looked up, his eyes vacant, seeing not the detectives but a ghost on a cliff from a lifetime ago. "We had a fight," he whispered, the words barely audible, yet they filled the room with the force of a thunderclap. The whispered words, "We had a fight," hung in the dead air of the interrogation room. They were an admission so small, yet they carried the colossal weight of 22 years of silence. As Julian Croft uttered them, the sterile gray walls of the room seemed to thin and dissolve, the hum of the ventilation system fading into the roar of a distant ocean. The harsh, fluorescent lights were replaced by the blinding golden sun of a California morning from a lifetime ago, and the truth, in all its brutal detail, came rushing back. Flashback, May 23, 2003. Present tense. The air is warm, thick with the scent of salt and blooming coastal sage. Julian stands on the cliff path, a knot of icy dread tightening in his gut despite the heat. The text from Slavik's enforcer is a brand on his brain. Today, Croft, no excuses. His life has been reduced to this single, desperate transaction. This elopement is not a union of souls, it is a leveraged buyout of his own future, and Ellie, his beautiful, trusting poet, is the primary asset. He sees her walking towards him, and for a moment his breath catches. She is lovely in a simple white dress, a vision against the impossible blue of the Pacific. But the radiant joy he expected to see on her face is absent. In its place is a cold, quiet stillness that terrifies him more than any anger. She doesn't speak until she is standing directly in front of him. She doesn't look at his eyes, but at a point somewhere over his shoulder. In her hand is not the velvet-wrapped book of poems he knows she has for him. It is a single folded sheet of cheap paper, a letter. "I was looking for a handkerchief in your coat pocket this morning," she says, her voice devoid of its usual melodic cadence. It is flat, brittle. "I found this instead." She unfolds it. He recognizes the letterhead of the predatory lending firm instantly. His heart seizes. It's the final notice from Slavik, the one detailing the consequences. "Final notice due to non-payment," she reads aloud, her voice trembling with a tightly controlled rage. "Principal loan of $500,000, default penalties, seizure of all assets, and physical repercussion." What is this, Julian? What is physical repercussion? He opens his mouth to deploy the charm, the easy lies that have always served him so well. "Ellie, darling, it's nothing. It's a business misunderstanding, a negotiation tactic. You know how these things are." "No," she says, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes, usually so full of warmth and dreams, are like chips of cold green sea glass. "I don't know how these things are, because my world doesn't include men who threaten you with violence. My world doesn't include a $500,000 debt that my fiancée conveniently forgot to mention." "I was going to tell you." He lies, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "After we were married, when things were settled—" "When my trust fund was settled, you mean," she says, the words a devastatingly accurate strike. "I called the family lawyer this morning, Julian. He was very forthcoming. He explained the terms of the trust. He explained how marriage would give you immediate access." She lets out a short, bitter laugh that is the ugliest sound he has ever heard. "Was this the plan all along? Was any of it real? Or was I just the most convenient solution to your problem?" The truth of her accusation is so absolute, so stark, that he has no defense against it. Panic, raw and primal, begins to claw its way up from his stomach. This is all slipping away. He is losing her. And with her, he is losing everything. "No, Ellie, that's not true. I love you," he pleads, reaching for her. His voice sounds whiny and false, even to his own ears. "The money is just a mess. It's a complication. It has nothing to do with us. We can fix it, but we have to do this today. We have to get married." She recoils from his touch as if he were diseased. The look on her face is one of utter revulsion. "Us?" she says, her voice dripping with contempt. "There is no us. There is you and your mountain of lies. And there is me, the fool who almost climbed it with you." She shakes her head, a final, resolute gesture. "The wedding is off, Julian. Everything is off. I can't marry you. I don't even know you." She turns her back on him to walk away, to leave him standing on the cliff with the ruins of his life. In that instant, his desperation curdles into a hot, blinding rage. It is the fury of a cornered animal, the indignation of a conman whose mark has just walked out of the trap. He sees his future a future of public humiliation, financial ruin, and brutal retribution from Slavic walking away in a simple white dress. "You can't do this to me," he snarls, the charming baritone gone, replaced by something ugly and guttural. He lunges forward and grabs her arm, spinning her back around. Her eyes widen in shock at his violence, quickly replaced by her own flash of anger. "Let go of me, Julian!" she cries, struggling against his grip. "You are not walking away from me," he yells, his voice nearly lost in the roar of the surf. "You are not ruining my life." "You ruined it yourself," she shouts back, shoving him hard in the chest with her free hand. "Let go!" He is momentarily stunned by her force, and in that split second of wounded pride and explosive rage he shoves her back. It is a petulant, thoughtless, dismissive act, a physical outburst of his thwarted will. It is not a calculated push to kill, it is the shove of a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. But they are on the precipice of the world. The grass is damp and slick from the morning's sea mist. Her simple heels offer no purchase. The shove is just hard enough. Her heel catches on an exposed cypress root. Her arms flail wildly, grasping at nothing but the salt-laced air. A look of pure, uncomprehending surprise flashes across her face. There is no time for a scream, only a sharp, stolen gasp as she tips backward over the edge of the cliff. Julian watches, frozen. Time seems to warp and stretch, the moment expanding into an eternity. He sees the white of her dress against the blue of the sky, and then she is gone. The sound of her body hitting the rocks below is a sickening, final thud, a sound that is almost, but not quite, swallowed by the crashing waves. For 10, maybe 15 seconds he is paralyzed. His mind is a white void of static. This isn't happening. I didn't. Then the void is filled with a single, overwhelming emotion. Not grief, not remorse, but a cold, sharp, animal terror for himself. They will find her. They will know. My life is over. This terror is a catalyst, shocking his system into a state of chilling, lucid clarity. He scrambles to the edge of the cliff, his heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. He peers down. He sees her broken form on the rocks at the water's edge, a discarded doll in the surf. As he watches in horror, a large swell part of the incoming tide lifts her gently from the rocks and washes her directly into the dark, narrow maw of a sea cave. His panicked mind registers it instantly. An opportunity. A miracle of timing and geography. The tide is rising fast. That cave, he knows from exploring here with her, is almost always completely submerged. It is a perfect, temporary tomb. He doesn't think. He acts. Pure survival instinct has taken over. He runs from the gazebo, not toward the road, but down a treacherous, half-hidden fisherman's path that zigzags down the cliff face. His expensive linen suit snags and tears on thorny bushes. He slips on the loose rock, his hand scraping raw against the stone. The physical pain is nothing compared to the roaring panic in his head. He reaches the base of the cliff and wades into the churning, freezing water. He finds her inside the cave, the water swirling around her pale limbs. He refuses to look at her face. He cannot look at her face. He is acting on pure mechanical adrenaline. He grabs her under the arms and drags her deeper into the cave's oppressive darkness, the grating sound of her dress against the rock a horrific counterpoint to the waves. He wedges her body into a deep crevice behind a large rock formation, pushing her back until she is completely hidden from the cave's entrance. As he turns to leave, his eyes fall on a glint of silver in a shallow pool of water near his feet. It's the book, the gift, the symbol of the love and the life he has just extinguished. It is an accusation lying in the water. He snatches it up, its cold weight feeling like a brand in his hand, and shoves it deep into the same crevice with her body. He is burying not just his victim, but the evidence of his lie. He is burying their story. He scrambles back up the path, his lungs burning, his mind a maelstrom of terror and calculation. He reaches the top, a different man from the one who descended moments before. He is no longer a fiancé. He is a killer. He must now become a mourner. He forces himself to be calm. He smooths his hair. He brushes the dirt from his torn suit. He looks at his reflection in a small puddle of rainwater, composing his features into a mask of anxiety and concern. He takes a series of deep, shuddering breaths, practicing the tremor he will put into his voice. Then he turns and walks with measured, purposeful strides back towards the gazebo, back towards the waiting officiant, back towards the first moment of the rest of his very long, very prosperous, and utterly hollow life. The performance is about to begin. The confession, once started, could not be stopped. It poured out of Julian Croft in a torrent of disjointed, self-pitying fragments, a desperate final attempt to contextualize his monstrous act as a moment of tragic weakness. But in the cold, sterile air of the interrogation room, there was no context that could soften the truth. When the narrative was finally complete, a profound, heavy silence descended. The story was told. The ghost had been heard. Detective Corbin, his face etched with a weary gravity, nodded slowly to Reyes. The time for psychological maneuvering was over. The clicking of the handcuffs as Reyes secured them around Julian's wrists was a sound that was both shockingly loud and deeply final. It was the sound of a 22-year-old debt finally being called in. "Julian Croft," Corbin said, his voice formal, devoid of all emotion, "you are under arrest for the murder of Eleonora Vance." He recited the Miranda rights, the familiar words, a stark, legalistic ritual that officially stripped away the last vestiges of the philanthropist and left only the prisoner. Julian offered no resistance. The energy seemed to have drained out of him completely, leaving behind a slumped, hollowed-out man who looked 10 years older than he had when he walked into the room. His expensive lawyer, Marcus Thorne, stood by silently, his face a grim mask. His job had changed from defending a reputation to mitigating a life sentence. The perp walk from the interrogation room to the waiting patrol car was a gauntlet of stunned, disbelieving faces. Secretaries, uniformed officers, and detectives from other departments stopped what they were doing to stare as the great Julian Croft, the man whose name was on hospital wings and university scholarships, was led past them in handcuffs. The illusion he had so carefully curated for a generation had evaporated in a single afternoon. The news of his arrest broke like a tsunami over the Monterey community. It was the lead story on every local and national news channel, the headlines a testament to the shocking betrayal. Monterey philanthropist, beloved benefactor charged in 1991 cold case murder of fiancée. In cafes and galleries, on fishing boats, and in corporate boardrooms, the reaction was a universal chorus of disbelief. People who had shaken his hand at fundraisers, who had applauded his moving speeches about loss and community, simply could not reconcile the man they knew with the crime he had confessed to. How could the man who had poured millions into preserving the very coastline where he had committed his crime be a killer? The cognitive dissonance was staggering. His entire public life, once seen as a testament to resilience, was now recontextualized as a grotesque, 2-decade-long performance of a lie. The J.V. Foundation, his monument to a manufactured grief, crumbled into a symbol of profound hypocrisy. For Detectives Corbin and Reyes, there was one final solemn duty to perform. The next morning they drove to the small, book-filled home of David and Marion Vance. It was a house that time had touched gently, a quiet sanctuary of intellectual and emotional warmth. Framed photographs of Ellie at 5 years old with a missing tooth, at 16 with an awkward smile and a stack of books, at 23 with a look of fierce poetic joy adorned every wall. It was a home where she was not a ghost, but a constant living presence. They sat in the living room, the Vances listening with a preternatural stillness as Corbin, his voice filled with a quiet compassion, walked them through the truth. He did not begin with the murder. He began with the lie. "The most important thing for you to know," he said, leaning forward, his gaze steady and kind, "is that Eleonora did not run away. She never abandoned you. She never stopped loving you for a single second. That entire story was a fabrication invented by Julian Croft to conceal what he had done." Marion Vance let out a small, ragged sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. For 22 years, beneath the grief of losing her daughter, there had been a second, more insidious pain. The pain of feeling abandoned. In that moment, Corbin gave her back her daughter's love, untarnished. He then explained, as gently as he could, the circumstances of her death, the argument, the confrontation, the fall. He spared them the most brutal details, but he gave them the truth, because he knew that the truth, however horrific, was better than the poison of uncertainty they had been living with for 2 decades. When he finished, David, who had been silent throughout, his hand clutching his wife's, finally spoke. He looked at a framed, handwritten poem of Ellie's hanging on the wall. "So he let us believe she was alive, somewhere out there for years," he said, his voice thick with a grief so old it was part of his very bones. "And then he let us believe she had chosen to leave us. He took her from us twice." "Yes, sir," Corbin said softly. "He did. But he is a man who will now spend the rest of his life in a world without beauty, without poetry, and without freedom. And you can finally mourn the daughter you had, not the one he invented." There was no sense of victory in the room, only a profound, heartbreaking sense of peace. The wound was still there, a crater in the center of their lives, but the infection of the unknown had finally been cleansed. They could now begin the long, quiet process of truly healing. Julian Croft's trial was a formality. His confession was absolute. The rest of his life would be spent in a concrete box, a world away from the sun-drenched cliffs and the endless ocean that had been the stage for both his greatest love and his most unforgivable crime. His philanthropy, once seen as his redemption, was now understood for what it was, a desperate attempt to build a legacy so bright it could cast a shadow dark enough to hide a monster. But shadows move. And tides turn. Months later, in a climate-controlled evidence locker deep in the bowels of the Monterey County Courthouse, the small, silver-plated book of poems sat alone on a shelf. Its journey was over. It was no longer a gift, no longer a clue, no longer a piece of evidence. It was simply a symbol of a love story that was violently interrupted. A testament to the fact that even the most carefully constructed lies are no match for the patient, relentless power of the truth. It was a silent, patient witness that had held its story in the crushing darkness, waiting for the sea to finally give up its dead and for the tide to bring justice home.